Wanda, written and directed by Barbara Loden, was released in the United States on February 28, 1971, becoming the only American film entry in the Venice Film Festival and winning the Best Foreign Film Award. Barbara Loden was born in Marion, North Carolina on July 8, 1932. She was born into a broken home. Her parents, being already separated and living in separate towns, decided it would be best for her to move in with her grandparents in an effort to give her a stable home life. She describes her early life as devoid of emotion. She remembers her childhood as hiding behind her grandmother's stove, never being seen, never wanting to be seen. She ran away from home at a young age, joining Robert Brown's physics circus, where she performed a series of acrobatic movements while an announcer connected her movements to certain laws of physics. She finally made it to New York in 1949, finding mild success as a pinup girl and a dancer at the Copacabana Club. While at the club, she began taking drama classes, or in today's terms, acting classes, with some of the other girls. She would continue with the lessons and start to try and find work in the entertainment industry. She found her first gig for the Ernie Kovacs show. Her job consisted of being chopped in half and having pies thrown at her face while wearing sexy and revealing outfits. Her success as a true actor would grow out of her early work on famed director Elia Kazan's pictures. She appeared in his films Wild River and Splendor in the Grass, earning minor notoriety as Warren Beatty's beautiful sister. Her most famous role and breakout performance was in After the Fall by Arthur Miller, a play directed by Elia Kazan. Loden played Maggie, a fictional version of the playwright's late wife, Marilyn Monroe. Kazan fought furiously for her to be cast, believing that due to her similar life experience, Loden would be extremely accurate in her portrayal of Marilyn. He was right. Her performance was one of her most personal and profound. During production, she and Kazan would spark up an affair, even though they were both already married. The pair would later be married in 1966. Soon after, with Kazan's encouragement, Loden would write the original version of Wanda after reading an article in the paper about a certain Alma Malone, a young woman who had been an accomplice to a botched bank robbery. Her story made headlines due to her thanking the judge after receiving her 20-year sentence. Seeing herself in this complacent young bank robber, Loden took the story and ran, turning into what we know today as Wanda. Funding for the film was particularly challenging. Finding someone to back the project of a then unproven director was almost impossible. That is, until during a safari vacation with her husband, Loden was offered $100,000 by successful producer and friend Harry Schuster. Encouraged by the generous proposal, Loden committed to refining and finishing Wanda. Production was rough and very run and gun. The film was not married to its script. Everyone was simply doing what Loden thought was right in the moment. The film received mixed reviews from critics in its initial release. Feminist groups also bashed it, believing Wanda's character was an insult to women everywhere. Today, however, it has 92% on Rotten Tomatoes, a cult following, and classic status. Michael Higgins was a veteran actor by the time of Wanda, and also a U.S. Army veteran who earned a Purple Heart and Bronze Star Medal during World War II. Wanda was by far not his first rodeo, and he along with Barbara were the only professional actors on set. Nicholas T. Prefers was the cinematographer behind Wanda. Loden hired him after seeing one of his films and being impressed by his ability to show ugly things without them appearing ugly. He was also a big documentary shooter, especially low-budget documentaries that forced him to do editing, sound, lighting, and camera work. His jack-of-all-trades experience was another major factor that convinced Loden that this man was the right guy for the job. Wanda came about during the very early years of a new type of Hollywood, aptly named the New Hollywood Movement or the American New Wave. This movement came around for much of the same reasons that the French New Wave came about, and unsurprisingly took a lot of inspiration from their European counterparts. Before this era, Hollywood was defined by the studio system. However, by the 1950s and 60s, Hollywood was dwindling as an industry. Things like TV and outdated boring films bogged down by the Hays Code were all but effectively destroying the industry. With the counterculture gaining momentum all across America, filmmakers began to also test the limits of what could be done with movies. Filmmakers ignored the studio system and made films on their own with very limited budgets. Films such as Cassavetes' Shadows in 1959, Little Fugitives by Morris Engel in 1953, and Shirley Clarke with Skyscraper in 1960 were what began to usher in a new age. The success of said films encouraged people like Loden that lending their voice to cinema could be possible without some big shot producer at MGM greenlighting their film. These new directors were simultaneously influenced and influencing the counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s, a movement best defined by the new youth who, unlike their parents, were granted a little more leeway in terms of leisure. They had more time to live and study. This newfound education and time allowed them to identify and mobilize against the antiquated traditions and systems of the past. Instead of conforming, they outright rejected the government, believing them to be the man who wanted nothing more than to destroy individuality. Vietnam was the most glaring proof that said accusation was correct. This, of course, led to nationwide protests. Civil rights, gay rights, and anti-war were all brought into the discussion. This movement stressed humanity, truth, reality, and no bullshit. These sentiments are an obvious influence of New Hollywood, a time where character and not story was the most important, where life was not dramatized, but reflected. The 1970s is when New Hollywood entered its golden age. The films credited for the explosion are Bonnie and Clyde and Easy Rider, two films that didn't care about showing too much violence or sex or cussing, but only cared for showing legitimate people portrayed on screen. Of course, the millions of dollars they made in the box office didn't hurt either. The success of these films were noticed by the studios, who began to adapt their models to better fit the auteur director. They did away with the studio system and instead began embracing filmmakers such as Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, Francis Ford Coppola, and Michael Cimino, and in an unprecedented move, giving them blank checks to do as they pleased. The embracement of New Hollywood brought films to the streets. The invention of lighter and more compact 35mm film cameras allowed for location shoots to become the norm rather than the exception. And now that the Hays Code was replaced with a viewer rating, films were free to show and do as they please. Films like Taxi Driver, Midnight Cowboy, The Graduate, Mean Streets, 5 Easy Pieces, and American Graffiti became huge hits. American filmmakers were now suddenly allowed to be auteurs inside the studio system. The New Hollywood era came to an end in the 80s after the massive successes of films like Jaws and Star Wars, and the massively destructive Michael Cimino epic Heaven's Gate that effectively closed United Artists after losing $120 million at the box office. Afraid of having a Cimino disaster on their hands, the studios pulled back the reins a bit and began to invest in more crowd pleasers. The result was the invention of summer blockbusters and blockbusters in general. Films like Back to the Future, Dirty Dancing, Indiana Jones, and lastly, E.T. I'd like to start off the why section of this video with a quote from Loden when talking about her husband's impact on her and Wanda. He taught me that what mattered most was not to remain silent. Before, I never said a word, I was always silent, and now what's left for me to do? He told me you've got to be heard. Everything that you do must be heard. That's why I made Wanda, as a way of confirming my own existence. At first glance, this may seem strange. Why would a film about her newfound sense of self revolve around a drifter, a woman with no sense of self? Well, up until Wanda, her existence had been as a drifter, as a person, much like Marilyn Monroe, a person operating for other people's pleasure and amusement. Someone who considered her opinions and beliefs just not worth sharing. With Wanda, Loden faced her past so that she may continue her life as a new person, a person with agency. Wanda is Loden on Loden. It is her newfound ability to own her experience, own who she is, and ask for what she wants. As well stated by Margaret Drass on Wanda, usually there is a distance between representation, text, subject, and action. Here the distance is completely eradicated. Hindsight is 20/20. Loden looked back on her past self, recognized it, dissected it, and then put it on the screen. Wanda would be coming straight off the heels of an era where conformity and silence were the norms, where codes and customs ruled cinema and life. What we saw with Wanda was a new type of filmmaking, one that remained true to life. The young people of the day were sickened by the culture of conformity that surrounded them in childhood. They wanted life again. They wanted to be free. Life in film had always had a degree of separation. It wasn't the truth. It was an example of what the truth could be. Loden and many others of the Hollywood New Wave brought real truth, real life back to cinema. Maybe not universal truths, but their truths, their experiences, and their reality. They studied their own humanity, and then they shared their findings with the world.